Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa. So wonderful to have you with us. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients, who makes the show possible. Imogene doing their thing, making it possible for the Uncommon Good. I'm Bo Bonner. You might know me, just perchance, by listening to the Catholic Morning Show here on Iowa Catholic Radio, of which I am the host. Bud, when people say, that guy looks familiar, why do you think they say that?
Well, I just kind of like to wander the streets throughout the day. Well, I work downtown Des Moines, specifically at Mercy College of Health Sciences, where I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, so work with our math, science, and English professors.
We've been at this thing called The Uncommon Good for 9 years. It's wonderful to be a part of that. One of the things we're going to talk about today, yes, it is a topic we've brought up before, folks. That is John Henry Newman, partly because of all that Bud has done in the said field. Also very important to some of the work that I'm doing. However, Bud, I think it merits returning to talking about him again because some very important things are coming up. On one hand, October 9th, that was his feast. So that just passed by, so always a good thing to return to, being thankful that he's a saint. But the big one is coming up November 1st on All Saints' Day. He's officially going to be made a doctor of the church. I'd say that's worth having an episode about.
Yeah, it's a big event. It doesn't happen very often. You think about the bimillennial history of the church, and Newman will be the 38th figure to be named a doctor of the church. So I'll be out there. It's great to celebrate it on the show and talk about it in this space.
So we are happy you are with us. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Today on the show, we are going to talk about one of the more momentous things happening in the church when a doctor of the church is proclaimed. We'll talk about what that means and everything like that. Very special to us, particularly Bud, but ever increasingly in my work as well. St. John Henry Newman, whose feast we celebrated on October 9th, he will be declared a doctor of the church. Important day for converts, important day for people who, subscribe in some way to John Henry Newman's theories on education, on ecclesiology. There's so much to get into. And then, Bud, of course, you've had a role to play in this, and you are going to get to be there as well. So we'll talk about that. But real quick, if you don't mind, Bud, when people talk about doctor in the church, just in case if people don't know what that means, it's not like John Henry Newman all of a sudden can check your liver or anything like that. What do we mean by doctor of the church?
Well, first, to be proclaimed a doctor, you have to be a saint. So there's already a pretty high bar. Not all of us will make it to that level of, hopefully all of us to heaven, yes. But, public renown that comes with sainthood and being raised to the dignity of the altar. But Newman is a saint, and there are revered figures throughout church history who have been given this title, doctor of the church. And it means, in short, like I always think, how do I capture this in a nutshell, that their work, especially in theology, is to be revered. So their research, their study, their writing is significant in some profound way. Many individuals throughout church history have written theology. You and I have dabbled in that ourselves. But when you look at the 38 figures who have been designated that title, it's like Catholics can go back to their work. They know these are holy figures, but also that their theology remains trustworthy, worthwhile for continued study. And so, I think, Bo, I don't want to be like Nostradamus or anything, but you look at, say, 20th century theology, which you and I have studied some. And there are figures who wrote a ton, someone like Karl Rahner or Hans Urs von Balthasar. My sense is they're probably not likely to be declared a doctor of the church. Not to,
shots fired.
Yeah. But you have figures like Augustine, Aquinas, Therese of Lisieux, Teresa of Avila. Most recently, before Newman being named a doctor of the church, St. Irenaeus, and now John Henry Newman. And so, if Catholics are sitting there saying, I want to learn more about the faith, where do I begin? The church has said, there are rich treasures with these particular figures.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily like a sort of stamp of saying everything they said is right, because just all those figures you just named, of course, they had differences of takes within theological concerns. I think what we're saying, I like how you put it, that there's a treasure trove with each of these people, and that these are sources the church says that if there comes a point when there's a theological disputation, when we have questions that arise, these are the people that we go, it would be profitable at all times to return to their work, to see what it might give us in terms of a perspective on something that we're looking at. So John Henry Newman, of course, again, you're not going to be able to exactly hold everything Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Teresa of Avila, and John Henry Newman say word for word, right? Like there's differences, there's different contours and things like this. But what the church says is you could hardly do better, maybe is the best way to say this, to go sit at the feet of these 38 doctors and first of all, let your intellect be shaped, but that when theologians are considering things worthy of being considered, that's part of their vocation within the church, that these are lodestones, and guiding stars to direct us in this wayfaring that is the work of theology throughout time.
Yeah, that's an interesting question that you raised there, or topic, I should say, Bo. At the end of the day, when questions arise about how to conclude about a specific argument that's taking place, we of course turn to the magisterium. And I think he's not a doctor of the church, but a really easy example of this sort of thing. Origen wrote a lot of important things about the study of Scripture.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, what he said about the end of time and about the restoration of all things, especially when it came to his followers, a council eventually said, this element of Origenism should be rejected. Mm-hmm. With these other figures, none of them flirted with heresy in the same way that we could say Origen did. But with Augustine, you draw maybe some things that he said about, I don't know, when he's arguing about with Pelagius, maybe some statements isolated go too far. And in that, I would say there are points in St. Thomas Aquinas where I would say, after further study and
the Immaculate Conception, for instance,
we've landed in a different place. But, theology is an argument across time. That's how tradition operates. And when you read someone like Aquinas, he's often looking back to Augustine as the source. Mm-hmm. And you begin to see how these conversations sort of build on each other and how these figures have helped the church to deepen its understanding. So Newman himself, at the end of one of his works, he says, I set this forth as the best explanation that I have for the development of doctrine. If the church, he basically says in writing that he cedes his own judgment to that of the church, and that the church may weigh in a precise manner, and that judgment should be accepted over his.
No, and I think that's precisely why he's a doctor of the church, is his imminent sense of being willing to ask how the contours of the history of the church itself, but theology can, as it wax and wane, but that the quality of obedience to the magisterium throughout time and the willingness, to have that patience is precisely one of the most foundational theological habits we should imitate with John Henry Newman. Yeah. And one of the interesting things, of course, in two ways, one hand that he's a convert, and that we have a lot of his work before he converted. On one hand, but it's very important for his development. He has the essay on the 4th century and the Arians, right? But he wrote that pretty early as an Anglican, I believe.
Yes.
So there's positions there he obviously doesn't hold by the time he's Catholic. So it's obviously not the case that to be declared a doctor of the church is to have a sort of imprimatur about everything you ever wrote, particularly when we have this guy who's a convert and we still have things he wrote before he converted. But even in his, as it were, definitively Catholic oeuvre, I would guess that St. John Henry Newman has insights that he would at least edit what he wrote. And to your point, like even taking something very specific, for instance, like on the development of doctrine, something I know that your research, especially in your PhD, was specifically about, it's probably fair to say in the places where he treated it, that there's nuances between them and that there's probably development itself, right, and how he actually deals with it. So I think this is what's important to talk about a doctor and something that we drone on about again and again, where we have such a sort of text-dominant understanding of this, right? So that if we hear someone declared a doctor, what we think is like, oh, we're giving a stamp about everything every time they put pen to paper. Mm-hmm. But the best way to say this is these are the saints whom we should imitate in their approach to theological questions, that they did so prayerfully, so that they did so with docility, that they used their brilliance in service of the church. And yes, the content of their ideas have a long-lasting impression, but the reason we're making them a doctor and not their works is because we think they had theological lives worth imitating, and that in some ways is the standard that they hand forward, even though obviously their ideas are extremely important as well. We make them doctors, these saints doctors, because they are worthy of imitation, and that's what hopefully raising John Henry Newman to this distinction of doctor on November 1st, 2025, is to say we should imitate him. And that's very meaningful to converts like you and I, Bud, who deal with positions we held before we became Catholic, and now that we are Catholic, to imitate John Henry Newman in reflecting on that fact, I think is very profitable indeed.
Yeah, I like how you put that about their theology being bathed in prayer. These days, a lot of the most prominent theologians, like the easiest way to get to that stage is to write a ton. And of course, many of these figures did. But there's not, in academic theology today, I don't think there's that emphasis on it having to be done bathed in prayer. And I feel like I'm talking more about Thomas Aquinas than Newman on today's show. But Aquinas, of course, like he famously, like folks would talk about, as he was wrestling with a theological question and they passed by his study, there was like this mystical bent to how he did theology. Of course, later in life, he had an experience when he was celebrating Mass where he said afterwards, like, I consider all that I've written as so much as straw, in light of what I've seen while celebrating Mass. And so there was always this like prayer is the foundation. It was really the fuel of what they're doing. But the second piece that jumped out to me about that last comment you made is the kind of doctor that Newman will be. So with many of these figures, they also receive sort of a title. Not all of them do, but Francis de Sales, for instance, is the Doctor of Charity. Cyril of Alexandria, the Doctor of the Incarnation. You've got someone like St. John of the Cross, the mystical doctor. And so there's this like additional sort of like descriptive title that captures their most significant accomplishment. And it's been fascinating with John Henry Newman, who lived during the 19th century, because there have been different titles that have been thrown out. And Pope Leo hasn't tipped his hand. We don't know if he will say something specific, but folks have said maybe Newman will be the Doctor of Conscience. This is a topic that he wrote, a lot about in some seminal writings. Maybe the Doctor of Converts. I think someone already has the Doctor of the English. Is it Anselm, maybe?
Yeah.
And so that title's taken. But that will be interesting to see. And I think the fact that there's been debate about different titles that could be ascribed to Newman shows that his life, it threads together these different, really important threads. So converts look back to him. He's revered by the English people, of course, like the first sort of like looming figure after the martyrs of the post-Reformation era. Like he wrote so much about ecclesiology, their education. There are these different elements of his life that come together in a really profound manner.
And I think that is a good segue into talking about you specifically, and you're being intertwined in all of this. We'll, of course, make sure to talk more about Newman specifically, but let's give the people what they're here for, Bud. You were a part of this process, so if you don't mind explaining what that means, like how can you be a part of the process of someone becoming a doctor? But how is it that theologians participate in this process of someone being, made a doctor. And what was that like? And, talk about what it felt like for this work that you've done in your career up to this point, being at the service of a saint that you've admired for so long.
Well, you've already mentioned today that my doctoral studies were on John Henry Newman, so it was specifically his work on the church that I focused on when I was writing my dissertation. Longtime listeners of the show might remember that for a few years, from 2017 to 2020, I was recording in Pittsburgh, where I was the director of the National Institute for Newman Studies.
We saw it through even when we were separated by time zones.
COVID couldn't stop us. Time zones couldn't stop us. But it was through that work, and I really got to tip my cap to we say Dr. Vater, like my father during the dissertation process, Kenneth Parker. He's an important Newman scholar himself. But it's through those relationships and some of my own writing that I was invited by Father George Bowen, who, Father Bowen, they say, provost of the Brompton Oratory in London. Mm-hmm. So the Oratorians who trace their lineage back to Newman, all the way back to St. Philip Neri in a lot of ways. There's an oratory in London, and the provosts are kind of like rector of that community.
Side note, absolutely gorgeous oratories.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Sorry.
He organized the petition. In Latin, we say Patrizio, and this is a collection of essays or arguments that are presented to the Congregation for the Cause of Saints. I think I have that title right. And so those who review, of course, some in the canonization process, but also when some saints are being considered as doctors of the church, there will be theologians who make a formal petition. And it was an interesting process. I had written before and published before. And when you publish, it's a lot of your own ideas. So it's kind of, what I mean by that is what argument do you want to advance? And Father George Bowen, as he was coaching us through this process, he said, don't make it flowery. Don't start beforehand with the conclusion that you want to reach. What you're trying to do is provide an objective, sort of unbiased, it's not an exercise in cheerleading, basically. And so the topic that was given to me was the magisterium or authority of the church. Mm-hmm. So really, I'm writing a chapter that says, what did Newman write and say about this? And I'm presenting that in as objective manner as possible. And then we did collect, so we wrote our chapters, and then each contributor also wrote a letter. And in the letter, it could be more forceful or persuasive in terms of what we're, this is why you consider what's been provided here. Mm-hmm. And this is why, we believe he should be a doctor of the church. So those were collected in a volume. It's a beautiful volume. If you ever visit my house for a glass of wine or whatever, we can look at it together. I say that because it's not being published. Mm-hmm. The Patizios are not, intended for public consumption. The contributors have talked about writing a separate volume where we could write on these topics and share our experience. But the Patrizio is collected, it was bound, presented to that congregation, and then they make a formal sort of recommendation to the Pope about how to proceed.
Wow. So how many people were involved? You were one of how many?
Yeah, I want to say 14. I should have counted that before the show started today, but it was around a dozen. And I mentioned the National Institute for Newman Studies because they really were very important in the process. I think their work with the oratory across the pond was key. And, their benefactors have, for years, the oratorians in Pittsburgh and the benefactors of NINS, they were involved with the cause for Newman's canonization. Mm-hmm. And similarly, they really wanted to see this take place. Now, I don't think, Newman deserves it. Right. And there wasn't any funny business or anything, but they've applied their resources, their time, their treasures, their prayers to help see this come to fruition.
Many of those people, lay people, of course, there was religious and clergy and things like that. But when you start to think about the cultus of a saint, right? So when you start to think about the sensus fidelium, right? That there's the sense of the faithful about, that's usually, Newman talks about this, but that's usually used as this idea of the sort of not even the conservative, but the sort of thing that like holds off innovation, or like makes us, when theologians like are thinking through things, the sensus fidelium is sort of this bedrock about like whether, what's coming up with has worked or not. But I also think it's this way to say that the faithful are often have this sense of saintliness and people worthy of devotion by just their sort of sheer acts, right? A lot of times when someone's made a saint throughout history, it's because a group of people started praying to this one saint for some reason. That's why patronage usually follows those lines. But I think in a real way, this is on the ground. I happen to be friends with someone who was a part of this in the life of the church, and it's exceedingly interesting and awesome and very just exciting to think that because there was this group of people in the UK, but also in the United States, who found Newman to be profoundly worthy of reflection and for their growth in holiness and closeness to the Lord. That, like you said, they took their time and resources to put this to the congregation in Rome to ask if this was a possibility. And Rome responded like Good Shepherd to her people and said that this is, in fact, worthy of calling John Henry Newman a doctor. We have a few minutes in this segment. Like we'll jump into some of the other things in the next one. But just to finish that up real quick with your chapter. So what would you say are the bullet points about what you said as terms of Newman on the magisterium?
Well, Newman always had a healthy respect for the hierarchy, and he recognized the significance of especially the Roman See, the Holy See, making a judgment on a particular theological question. I do think what stands out from Newman, especially during his time period, is there was a movement among some theologians to really heavily emphasize the authority of the Pope. And in a time period where philosophy and there were some other currents in politics were sort of like undermining people's sense of the reasonableness of the faith. We don't have time to get into that, but like the rise of skepticism or scholarship that would call into question pillars of the faith. It was tempting for some to say like, well, God has provided us the papacy, true statement. It's a particular gift, et cetera, et cetera. There's this movement at this time at Vatican I, 1869 to 70, to have a dogmatic definition of when a pope can make infallible statements. And I bring that up to say, like, it would have been easy in that time to fall back on that and to say, like, the papacy there is sort of like to dispel all doubts. Mm-hmm. And Newman provides, I show like a more robust description of the magisterium and of authority in the church. In one of his most important writings on these matters, he talks about three offices, like the prophet, priestly, and kingly offices of the church that mirror how these offices operate with Christ. All that to say, like you mentioned, the faithful, the sense of the faithful, the work of theologians, the like devotion of people, like all of these are sources of the church's reflection on theology. And so the papacy, as important as it is not sort of like an
oracle by itself.
It's not an oracle, yeah, and it's the weight of it can be overstated, and even the Pope, when he makes pronouncements in this manner, like he's using all of those other sources. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was a real gift to the church. In the wake of it, like people say, like, well, the church is not a democracy, which is true, and which is not what Newman was saying, but but it's a very like robust, full ecclesiology that takes into account like the entire body of Christ.
Yeah, and as you said, rightly so, because people were reacting against modernism, and three popes in a row, Pius IX, Leo XIII, and then Pius X, all very much determined to head off at the past modernist issue, like revolutions that would make the faith not what the faith was. It's unpopular to tease out the nuance about like, okay, but the entire church and its ecclesiology stands against modernism. It's, as you said, let's not take a shortcut. Let's have the fullness of the faith be able to stand up to modern critics, but also truly say that there's a role that all of us play It's a bifurcated role, right? It's a hierarchical one, even if that we want to say. But just as the body has many parts, but the parts don't do all things equally. That to me is what I've always learned from you, both in talking about the magisterium and ecclesiology, in terms of John Henry Newman, is taking serious what St. Paul says about the body of Christ, and that there being many members, and the members all have their dignity and specific role there to play, and that if we homogenize this, we ruin something about the body, but if we overemphasize one part of the body over the others, we also miss the brilliance and beauty and the not the design, but the sort of way in which the body is constituted by the Father on purpose here in history. We're going to talk more about this. There's so much more to bring up. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. I want to thank Imogene Ingredients for making the show possible. They underwrite The Uncommon Good, and we appreciate it. We're talking about the fact that St. John Henry Newman is going to be made a doctor of the church coming up November 1st. His feast was on October 9th, so we figured it was a good weekend to talk about what John Henry Newman means to us, but also the fact that our very own Bud Marr, right here in the flesh, had a part to play in all of these proceedings that will end up with St. John Henry Newman being named a doctor of the church. So if you've missed any of that, Bud went into the role he played in that with some other scholars in the first part of the show, so make sure to pick up on that. Bud, the next cool thing that I'm jealous of, and I don't want to ever hear you complain about your life ever again, is you get to go be in Rome. So let me back up. You were at the canonization,
yeah,
and now you get to be at the doctorization. I don't think that's the official word.
That's good, though.
In Rome. So I hate you, and it's no fair. No, I'm kidding. This is incredibly awesome. I'm excited through you that you get to go do this. So not that you have to tell us your whole itinerary and what Italian food you plan to eat or anything, but what's going on here, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so on November 1st, Pope Leo will be celebrating a Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. What's kind of cool about how it worked out is that this will be at the conclusion of the Jubilee of the world of education. That's kind of a mouthful. I think they should have named it the Jubilee of Global Education, but there's part of the Jubilee year.
Probably in Italian, it's better.
There's a specific sliver of that's dedicated to education and conversations around that. As we talked about during the first segment, you could see how that topic was important to Newman. So that feels apropos. But in St. Peter's, All Saints Day will be there, and as part of the liturgy, there will be this official proclamation. So we know Newman's a doctor of the church. It's not like Pope Leo could yank that away, but. So that will be the big event. When I talked to Father George about who's organizing this, he said there's a chance that we would have an audience with the Holy Father. I don't want to jump the gun on that. It's sort of like when I'm watching Nebraska football, I try to not bring any energy into the room that might make it not happen.
Nice.
But either way, I'll be close to the Bishop of Rome, and it will be amazing to see that, to be at that Mass. And then around the Mass, there are various kind of conversations taking place that week. I won't bore you with the sort of details, but symposia and things where Newman's significance to the life of the church and the history of the church will be discussed.
Wow. So do you get to talk?
I'm giving a brief synopsis of that chapter.
Okay, that's awesome.
The Pope's not going to be listening to that talk.
Do you know what building you're going to be in? It'd be what I worry about you. So this, I'll say it so you don't have to worry about it. Is there's a billion awesome buildings in Rome you can speak at, yeah. But I hope they don't put you in the newest shed made in 1978. That's like a tin box or something. So I'm hoping you get a really cool building because it's Gregorian.
The Gregorianum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to be better. I'm not a planner. And
you're just going to go where they tell you.
What makes it even worse this go around is that they're arranging buses from our accommodations to the Vatican. So I'm I'll get on the bus. I'll follow the crowd.
You'll just do what you're told. I like it. No, very exciting stuff. And I know that you're too humble to say this, but one more time, First of all, absolutely deserved all the hard work that you've put in studies with John Henry Newman. You are exceedingly humble about your role in all of this. But as your co-host and longtime friend, I declareth that I'm beyond happy to see the work you've done pay off, to that you get to be a part of something so exciting. And, there's so much that happens in the church. And for us here in Des Moines to be privileged to know a part of history, like you're a part of history now, man, whether you like that or not. I'm excited for you. And I hope for many years to come, people bother you with questions about this when they see you, maybe buy you a beer the next time they see you in a restaurant.
Well, what's one thing that's cool about the Catholic faith, we've talked on the show about the importance of like incarnational leadership, and the Catholic faith is so tangible. So we have all these doctrines and dogmas that you can study, but there's this kind of like, there's no better term, like an incarnational element to how the faith has been preserved and how it's practiced. What's cool about Newman, like you read someone like St. Augustine, and that time period does feel so far away, and the world was different than ours is today. Newman was I think he really lived on the brink of the world that we're living in now.
Yeah, like he arrived in Oxford in a horse and carriage and left on a train. Isn't that his statement?
Something like that, yeah. And so, he spent his latter years in Birmingham, and I've walked those streets. When you go to Birmingham, I think the place in the oratory that I was most moved by is that Newman was an early riser, so much different than me, but he would wake up shortly after 4 each morning and spend time in prayer, celebrating Mass, and to go to his study where he had a little chapel with space carved out and the saints that he revered along the walls, those who had passed on who he was praying for, and just to be there and to see the study pretty much preserved as he would have resided within it. There's something profound about that. With figures like Augustine and Aquinas, we have, I don't want to say academic writings, but we have basically their corpus is made up of like technical theological manuals. With Newman, he wrote, we've collected his letters into over 30 volumes. And because of that, we can see like his psychology at work. We can almost like see his sanctification taking place. And he's very flesh and blood. Like we don't know so much like when Aquinas was rubbing shoulders with his fellow Dominicans, what did he think of Father brother so-and-so or whatnot. With Newman, we see those relationships and friendships developing. We know the times that he struggled, like during Vatican I, it was a difficult time for him. And so we can look at those things, and it's not like Newman was clearly a very holy man. Accepting Our Lady and maybe St. John the Baptist, we can say each of us at times falls into particular sins. So Newman wasn't perfect, but he was very holy. But we see that holiness lived out like in the woof and wharf of day-to-day life.
We go back to our warp and weft difference. No, I'm kidding. I do think that starts to be, there's multitudes of saints that sort of hit every age in different ways, right? So on one hand, we do have the saints from long ago, and it's important to have the saints from long ago. Then we have the saints that are sort of like a mid-range away from us. In some ways, I think about like the Reformation saints for us, like the things they did and decisions they made still have a lot of importance to, like, you and I don't have the conversions we do except for some of the efforts that the Counter-Reformation saints made. But then we start to go like, okay, we have saints that are extremely close to us, right? So like it's no wonder that St. Carlo, for instance, is important to many people. But then we have, I'm going to guess, I don't know how I could prove this, but and I already have too much I'm supposedly supposed to be researching. I truly wonder if there's like the saints of about 100 years ago. I have this inclination to think they have a very particular role throughout church history, that there's always about like certain saints that are about a century and a half away from the current age, whenever that age is, and that they have a very important role to play in the life and the thought of the people at the time. Tell me if I'm wrong. Does Philip Neri fall into that for that sort of era for John Henry Newman? I guess it's a little more. That's like more like 200 years.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of
that's like
Neri's exact time frame because he's post-Reformation, so 2 or 3 centuries prior to Newman.
Yeah, so like I think you start to see, right, that like 100 to 200 years maybe, let's like call it that I wonder if you go back and see the sort of impression they make upon people like in the here and now, that starts to play a particular role. So to me, it makes sense to start calling people to think about the doctors of the church that are, 2-ish centuries away. Yes, Irenaeus was most recently made a doctor, and he's very ancient. That was sort of like a long time coming. But I start to think about that. Newman is far away enough from us that he has that sort of critical distance, as it were. But to your point, he was dealing with exactly parallel things that we're dealing with. So like the grand technological changes, those changes were different for him, but they seem very native to us. And I think that's why him being made a doctor now is very timely.
Well, as you were talking, you've probably heard that quote from G.K. Chesterton where he says, God raises saints for a particular age to serve as an antidote to that period's specific spiritual illness. I forget exactly how he says it. Something like a saint provides a medicine that restores the world to sanity by exaggerating whatever the world neglects. And I really see that with Newman. I was already mentioning skepticism. So I do think there's something unique about this time period. So you're saying late 19th century, early 20th century, where the church had faced a world previously that was godless. So the church arose. Well, that's not exactly the right way to put it. The church arose like in a context of a paganism where there were a multitude of gods. And Christianity, when it first came to influence, was seen as a form of atheism because in some ways it was a rejection of that cultus.
Right.
Newman said the world has never known a truly godless society. And so we are moving to a place where a lot of the most prominent intellectuals were sort of questioning not even simply specific doctrines, but the very approach of faith. Mm-hmm. And I think Newman arises as an antidote to that spiritual sickness because he was someone who didn't fall back to a kind of fideism, like a sort of just the church says it, that settles it. Mm-hmm. But he wanted to wrestle with those currents and address them directly. I think even when it came to things like biological evolution or other sort of philosophical conversations that were taking place, Newman, he didn't live long enough to provide really detailed responses to those things, but he didn't run away from them, and he didn't automatically say well, this just has to be rejected because it came, so to speak, from outside the church.
Right.
Newman, I think, shows how faith and even the exercise of conscience is another form of rationality. It is an intellectus, but of a different sort. And so I think he was very careful in saying, some of the conclusions that we draw as people of faith, they're not syllogistic reasoning. It's not sort of the kind of logical progression that you would follow if you were doing a math proof. Mm-hmm. And there's deductive and inductive reasoning. There's different ways that the mind operates, but the exercise of conscience shouldn't be rejected because it doesn't have this kind of precision that we might expect from other forms of reasoning. It does tell us something important about the world. Yeah,
and I think that thinking of work that I got a chance to do with Dr. Kristen Collier, a good friend of mine, where Newman talked about medicine at the end of the lectures that he gave attached to Idea of the University. And to your point, he talks about how, ostensibly, he's speaking to the medical college, the one part of the Trinity College in Ireland that still persisted. And on one hand, the point is medicine can't solve everything, right? There's a way in which you can imagine a summary of that seems like it's being negative to medicine. But his actual point is the power of medicine, right? And in a sort of prophetic way, because medicine was only starting to even barely come into its own compared to what it is now. But Newman actually engages medicine by pointing out its power, and its power for good, and its power to explain a lot of things. And he goes, and yet still then, if we let it sort of take over all of the fields of knowledge, that this is what we're going to be missing, and that it still has to be willing to take its place at the seat of theology as the queen of the sciences. All that to say, there's an easy way in that time period to go, well, this new medicine, it's going to cause all sorts of problems, and because it's not part of the church, we need to boot it out. But that's not what he did. Yeah. He said precisely by taking serious medicine's power and what it can do and the great things it's capable of, then we can actually engage it to say, this is its limitations, and this is why theology and philosophy are so elemental in the study of medicine. And so him being willing to take serious the benefits of medicine, the power of medicine, what it can do, its astounding possibilities, and the great potential that he, again, in the 1800s predicted and died before you really saw what he was saying come to fruition. Because he was willing to do that, we as a church have a better engagement with medicine than if we would have just wrote it off as the bad thing that the new secular world is coming up with.
Wouldn't you say that Newman had a really keen sense of the relationship between ideas and even fields of knowledge?
Yeah.
So when you talked about medicine there, Newman at one point when he's writing his idea of a university, and he's talking about how the university is meant to be a place that explores all fields of knowledge, he says, there's this temptation today to bracket certain fields of study, maybe especially theology. It's not meant for everyone, and maybe it doesn't have a place in a university that was funded by the government or something. He says, if you, the actual question is is theology a science? Is it a worthwhile field of inquiry? If it is, and he assumes that it is, and you bracket it, it's not going to make the work that a university does more rational. It's going to create a vacuum.
Yep.
And then that vacuum will be filled by another
science
that tries to answer the questions but does it poorly.
And doesn't have the resources to do so.
So you look at our day and age. I know they're less popular now, but figures like the New Atheists, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins. You read someone like Richard Dawkins, I haven't looked at his work in biology, but he's respected in that field. When he tries to opine on philosophy and theology, it's worse than an introductory college student writing his first essay. And so he seems to kind of assume that because he's built a strong reputation in the sciences that he could automatically speak to metaphysical questions with authority, and it's kind of a circus. I mean, it's a train wreck.
And one of the things that's funny, of course, is Newman in that case is not saying that people should be overly specialized. He wants to say that if people take a robust philosophical habit of mind, that they'll actually pursue multiple sciences and realize that when they come across different questions, that a multitude of sciences would be necessary to answer multiple aspects of the same truth.
Yeah.
So he's actually more, I would say, thinking of the well-rounded man, the young woman formed in all of the liberal arts, the student who takes the time to understand the full circle of the general aspect of knowledge. So he's not some sort of specialist saying how dare a biologist talk about something else. What he's saying, though, is because people have so overly specialized and thought, like you said, that there's sciences that are sort of options that you don't need to run into them anymore, when they then try to approach those fields, they seem like a drunk British person at a pub who had free time and wrote a book on something that they had no clue about. Even and I mean, this starts to be after some of this dust is cleared, right? We're past that sort of moment in the popular discourse. I think multiple atheists have said no, this was all actually rather embarrassing. There's actually better atheistic arguments than the sort of cold, horrible British beans for breakfast we were served with Dawkins and people like him. But this is to say, Newman's insight, Bud, that we've brought up multiple times, that if you could choose to have a library and students have the ability to sort of just like hash things out versus the best professor lecturing in the world. And he, of course, doesn't want you to choose between them. But if you had to, he'd choose the first, right? Yeah. That he has this sort of like not an enlightenment optimism that the truth will just like sort of float to the top, but that in order to have a sort of universal knowledge, like a philosophical habit of mind, that there has to be this willingness to do education, to draw out from people this sort of full field of interaction and inquiry. And that's why, again, this is what this all started with.
Yeah.
That's exactly what our age needs now, is people who are willing to stand against the reactive modes, the digital age, right? Like we're just trying to get reactions out of people, fragment us and make us scared, and then like we enter echo chambers and all the things we've talked about in the show. That Newman says, no, there's really a way forward to do something better about this.
Well, I love the fact that Newman was willing to challenge the shibboleths of the age, and you know this part of his work better than I do, but as he's organizing educational institutions, he says there with the curriculum, there has to be this architectonic philosophy that unifies it and brings it all together. Mm-hmm. And so what I mean by challenging the shibboleths of the age is there are folks at that time, like key leaders, who are saying, well, if we bracket religion, like we will have more rational students, et cetera, et cetera. And Newman he calls the lie on that and says, there's going to be some sort of like foundational approach that organizes your curriculum all together. And if you reject what's traditionally done so, you'll land in a different place. And I love the fact that as Newman does that sort of thing, he's willing to enter the ring. Mm-hmm. So going back, like we're talking about education right now, I mentioned during the first segment his views on the magisterium. For Newman, like the church's infallibility, the church's ability to speak definitively on certain questions, he doesn't approach that as sort of like, this is an easy way to solve all our problems. He says human reason needs this, because human reason is this like far-ranging sort of like energetic capacity that it needs a sort of like counterbalance. And so he talks about human reason and the authority of the church as operating in sort of like a tug of war, but that doesn't concern him at all, because he thinks the truth will naturally emerge if we go about this search in the right manner.
Right. Anchored as it is by precisely that. And that in the ring mentality, right? He was willing to hash things out in the papers, right? Which was sort of like a very public forum.
Yeah, it's great. He was kind of like this slight priest, like sort of a, like not a large man, and kind of like reserved and even shy in social encounters. But he really, like, his most famous works were amazing arguments with other people.
So this is all to say we're very grateful. Ask him to pray for us. As I said, October 9th was his feast. The big day coming up November 1st, when he is going to be declared a doctor of the church. It's always wonderful to get to rope back around and talk about what St. John Henry Newman means to us. But one more time, to embarrass Bud. Bud, thank you for your work involved with a whole group of people to make this day coming up a reality. We hope you travel safe and that you have a blessed time being a part of the celebration of Newman being made a doctor of the church.
Yeah, thank you. One quick preview. I'm going to be talking with Bishop Joensen on his show in the near future about this very topic, so something to look forward to.
Absolutely wonderful. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, praising the fact that John Henry Newman will be a doctor of the church on November 1st. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. We want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients for making the show possible. They underwrite the show. Not everybody's going to need to use their products, but if you can and if you do, cattlemen out there, make sure to go check out Imogene Ingredients. Bud, as always, wonderful show. But like I said, just a wonderful opportunity to say thank you to the Lord for John Henry Newman being made a doctor of the church, and so awesome to be a part of living history, and the fact that you got to play a part in that.
Before we share our prayer schedule, I sometimes do this at the end of shows, just so people think I don't know what I'm talking about. I think during the show I mentioned the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. This is one of those things, like RCIA is now OCIA. It's now the dicastery.
Okay.
The name has shifted, but I was thinking old school.
We didn't think you were lying.
All right. Well, if you please join us in our prayer life at Iowa Catholic Radio. We broadcast the Rosary on air at 4:30 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., and 8:30 p.m. In the afternoon, right before 3, we do the Chaplet of Divine Mercy, but you can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
You can also figure out what we're up to here in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area by going to iowacatholicradio.com and clicking events. You can click on our business sponsor page to make sure to visit and say thank you to our business sponsors that make all of our shows on Iowa Catholic Radio possible. But remember that this ministry is not just the folks behind the mics, behind the boards, or behind the desks. It's your ministry as well. You make it possible, and you can donate at iowacatholicradio.com by clicking on the donation button. Safe and secure. Make sure to go do that to keep us on air. Bud, once more, thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for letting me talk about this.
We are, anytime. It's your show, too. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our family, our city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.